Hey everybody, I'm Jack with Future Pastimes. I'm a designer of Dune-themed games, and thank you for joining me as we continue to read Dune. We are now on to the next chapter where Paul and Jessica start out just having gotten through the next day, and they're in their still tent, and night has fallen. And Paul is looking out onto the desert and just sort of soaking it in, realizing that it is such a different environment than what he's used to, but realizing that there is something about the desert, and he starts to think about, this you could make a life here. You could do well. And Jessica remarks to herself how Paul seems to have quickly adjusted to the new situation. And she also allows herself to think, probably the plus side here is that you're not having to always look over your shoulder, sort of a thing. And an interesting passage that caught my eye that I really like. It's she recalls a Bene Gesserit axiom: the mind can go either direction under stress, toward positive or toward negative, on or off. Think of it as a spectrum whose extremes are unconsciousness at the negative end and hyperconsciousness at the positive end. The way the mind will lean under stress is strongly influenced by training. So that, again, is the heart of the Bene Gesserit way. And a couple of times in this chapter, both characters are having to remind themselves of their training and their ways to overcome whatever is going on. So what they do is they pack up and they realize they've got to try to head for the plant life that they saw way off in the distance near some rock, because they think that's the most likely path forward for them to try to find Fremen that they can hopefully seek sanctuary with. So Paul plants a thumper on a timer. It says, we'll have about 30 minutes before it activates, and that's going to draw a worm, which will hopefully give us enough time to cross this fairly sizable stretch of desert. But they have to walk without rhythm, and Paul demonstrates it, and part of it is he's able to do it from some of this prescience that he's experiencing it. So it's almost like a future memory. But he does it, and Lady Jessica is able to emulate that movement. But she is very taxed by it, and Paul is as well, because Frank Herbert is describing this really unusual, walk, drag your leg, wait, step. And I think it's very easy for me to imagine Frank out in the desert doing this, because the way he describes its taxing effect on them is quite vivid. It's a really unnatural movement. The body's not used to it. And then walking on sand is also can be very exhausting after a long while. If you've ever had a long walk on the beach, you've got the part that's still wet, that's packed down a little bit. That's actually easier to walk on than just the sand itself. It can be pretty grueling if you're walking a long distance on it. And here they are. They're going a long distance. And after, before they know it, the thumper activates. And then not long after that, they can hear the worm. And then they can't hear anything but the worm because it's so loud. And the thumper goes off. And now they know that the worm is out there. And they're doing their best. And then they hit the drum sand. And that is sand that's got a kind of a solid undersurface that basically sounds like a drum when you walk on it. It makes a loud booming sound. And now they know that they are out of time. The worm is going to gun for them, so they start to run. And they were not, they were just over the halfway point. Frank Herbert mentions they'd reached a point where the rock in front of them and the rock behind them were equally distant. And so they're hauling buns to try to get to the rock. And Jessica remarks to herself that at least, her body is used to this. The running was a relief, even though it's still exhausting. And she's wiped out by this whole ordeal. At least it's something the body is used to, and she can get some energy from that, even though they fall down. And they get themselves back up, and the worm is bearing down on them. And as they're getting close to the rock, they see that there are these little poles that are in the sand that are almost like creating a marked path. And so they run past a couple of them without even fully comprehending what they're seeing. But later they realize, yeah, it's leading the way into a crevice in the rock. But they barely beat out the worm, and the worm comes up, and it's basically just hovering over them, and it's enormous. And Paul is able to suppress, the primal fear. And Jessica remarks to herself that she's barely able to suppress it. They're just so in awe of this creature. And they're taking it in. They can see all the giant teeth that are made into crysknives for the Fremen. And then they hear another thumper. It draws the worm away. And so they're able to get to the rock and catch their breath. And Paul's like, it's got to be the Fremen. They've called another worm. And Jessica's like, well, why would they help us? And Paul's like, maybe they just called the worm. And she's like, why would they do that? And Paul he's like, I almost think I know the reason why. And again, it's part of that prescience, part of that memory, that sense of memory. He can't quite put his finger on it, but he feels like there's definitely a reason. And it reminds him that he feels like there's got to be some connection between the worm and the spice. And that also reminds him of something that Liet Kynes had said that almost seemed like a whoops, I've said too much moment that Paul picked up on. And but they can't really linger on that, so they head into the crevice. It's really dark in there, but they're able to navigate and use their other senses. And then they get in, and there's like a little basin inside where the moonlight can come in, and they can see there's all kinds of plants, and there's also animals and mice scurrying around. And then a bird of prey swoops down and gets one of the mice and reminds them, yeah, we're on Arrakis, so be on your toes. And then they're like, great, why don't we set up the tent, we'll get some rest, and then we can try to find the Fremen. And then they hear a voice. Most people regret finding the Fremen, and they realize they are not alone in this cave. And they're like, that was really stealthy. We did not hear these people, because then they hear another voice, let's hurry up and get their water so we can go on. And Jessica's like, they want us for our water. And she's like, I'm not crazy about that idea. And then Paul he starts to back away out of panic. And then again, it's his training. He realizes, no, I have to open up all of my senses, and I've got to suppress that panic because I need to be able to focus. And so that's what he's doing, and that's where the chapter ends. So they've found the Fremen, but the Fremen are clearly not there to help them. So they have to they've got to try to use all their wits, and they're pretty wiped out after crossing the desert there and just barely making it in front of that Shai-Hulud. But yeah, so it's an interesting chapter. A lot of detail on what it's like to have to walk across the desert. It's why I think I'm fairly convinced that on one of his many sojourns around the world that Frank Herbert probably tried walking without rhythm, and it was like, yeah, you can go a little while and then you just like, this sucks. And so I'm pretty sure that that's what happened, because he put a lot of effort into describing what that was like and just how it really drains you. So it's really interesting. And I've had friends too that have tried doing the walk without rhythm on the sand, and they give up after about 20 feet. They're like, I don't want to do this anymore. Let the sandworms get me. So there you have it. Let me know if you have any questions or any thoughts on this chapter. In terms of adaptation, this was actually fairly closely adapted in the Villeneuve movie. It's the only one of the adaptations that focused on the drum sand. So in the Lynch one, it was kind of compressed with some other stuff. They're crossing the desert. The worm shows up. They run and they get in there. There's some crazy green screen of Paul falling down a rock, and then they get into the cave. The Lynch movie and the miniseries actually had them in a cave, whereas the Villeneuve movie, they encountered the Fremen. They're kind of out in the open. So it's okay. I actually do prefer the in the cave version from the Lynch movie better. especially because it has that great shot where suddenly you see that there's like 50 Fremen in that cave, and then Jessica's like, oh, such stealth and didn't hear a thing. That's a great shot. Whereas in the Villeneuve movie, it's a little more pedestrian, so not as interesting. And we'll get more into that because we're just at the very beginning of that particular scene in terms of the book. So, like I said, let me know if you have questions or comments. Let me know what you think of this chapter. Thanks for reading along, and we'll see you again soon.